the School of Humanities, and it's great to see so many people here finding out about art history and art theory. Now, before we begin this evening, I'd like you to do three things for me. The first thing is, please switch off your mobile phones. Please do that. And the second thing is, please switch on your brain, because our speaker today wants to rearrange your brain so that you look at artworks differently. And the third thing I want you to do is something physical. I want you to put your hands together and to welcome a person who is himself an articulate artwork. Please welcome the Dean of the Faculty of Arts, Professor Cam Louis.
Daniel, Professor Hay, Mr. Lee, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure as the Dean of the Faculty of Arts to welcome you here today to the inaugural M.B. Lee Distinguished Lecture in the Humanities. I'd like to start by thanking Mr. M.B. Lee, who's sitting just back there, who is with us tonight, for his generosity in initiating a series of lectures that promotes the recognition of and the tremendous benefits of the arts and the humanities that they bring to our lives. As a recipient of the M.B. Lee Endowed Professorship in the Humanities and Medicine, I am personally grateful to Mr. Lee for his belief in the healing powers of the humanities. Indeed, Mr. Lee has been supporting our institution for almost 40 years, and in 2010 was presented with an honorary university fellowship in recognition of his contributions to the university and the community. Today's lecture also marks the launch of our faculty centenary celebrations, which will run from October 2012, that is this month, to September 2013. Over the coming months, we'll be holding a variety of public events and activities that showcase the faculty's extraordinary contributions over the past 100 years. Among these is the Arts Centenary Photography Project, which I assume most of you would have seen as you walked in here. On show for the first time in the foyer prior to this lecture are some of the photographs taken by the award-winning Hong Kong photographer So Hin Kiao. These images captured in the last 2 months prior to the faculty's move to its new premises in the Run Shore Tower offers glimpses of its history and, most importantly, some of the people who have made it what it is today. That is, it's one of the finest humanities faculties in the region and internationally. As you may have deduced from its title, the articulate artwork, the first lecture in this series, was suggested by the Department of Fine Arts. Founded in 1978, the department has helped train an entire generation of leaders in the Hong Kong art world, and I know that there are many fine arts alumni in the audience. And thank you all for joining us, for those from the department. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Professor Jonathan Hay. Professor Hay is also Mellon Blues Professor at the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University. He is one of the world's foremost scholars in Qing art, together with the many postgraduate students who have benefited from his supervision. He is helping reshape the field of Qing studies. He has published widely in the Chinese arts from the Tang Dynasty to the present, and on the theory and method of art history. Tonight, by focusing on single Chinese artwork, Professor Hay will challenge us to think of art in a new and more active way. So instead of asking what an artwork means or represents, Professor Hay asks, what does it do? What linkages does it articulate between the viewer and the viewer's sense of his or her place in the world? Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Jonathan Hay.
It's a great honour to be part of your centenary. I think this is a wonderful university, and it's a great honour to inaugurate this distinguished lecture series funded by M.B. Lee. Thank you, Mr. Lee. I promised to focus today on a single artwork. And as you can see, it's not the artwork on the poster. It's a very famous Chinese painting by the artist whose work I know best, Shi Tao. Could we have the lights down in the auditorium? Because otherwise the painting will look rather washed out. No, can we have them down? Darkness would be best. And there was darkness. Shi Tao was born in 1642 at the very end of the Ming Dynasty, and he died in 1707, late in the Kangxi reign. This painting is known today under the title Gazing at the Waterfall at Mount Lu, but we will see shortly, in fact you can see right now if you're clever, that this title is not quite accurate. I prefer to call the painting simply The Waterfall at Mount Lu. It's a hanging scroll of large dimensions, a little over 2 meters high. Shi Tao executed the painting in ink and colour washes on silk. Although the painting is undated, we know from the seals that Shi Tao impressed on the silk surface and from the style of the painting that he must have painted it sometime between 1699 and 1702, between the ages of 58 and 61 Sui. Shi Tao was then at the height of his powers as an artist, the master of an astonishing range of pictorial and calligraphic craft that he placed at the service of his powerful imagination. Unfortunately, we don't know who the original recipient of the painting was, nor do we know the painting's whereabouts during the remainder of the Qing dynasty. The painting now resides in Kyoto at the Senoko Hakkokan Museum. It was donated to the museum by Sumitomo Kansetsu, who acquired the painting before the Second World War. Today, it's unfashionable in universities, at least in North American universities, to focus on masterpieces. Well, this is a masterpiece. If I'm going to hold your attention for 50 minutes with a single artwork, I need an artwork that is unusually rich and complex. Through a slow consideration of this one painting, I want to reflect on a change that has taken place during my adult lifetime in the way that we understand culture in general and art in particular. Although I shall be talking today about a Chinese painting, I'm using the word art in a very broad sense. Another speaker could have chosen a novel, or a poem, or a piece of music, or a film, to discuss the same change in thinking. It's a change that has crept up on us slowly. Although change began as early as the 1970s, for a long time, it was hard to see, even for the very writers on art who were making it happen. I say this with some confidence because I've been one of those writers, and I certainly did not realize until very recently what was happening at the time. How can that be? Well, therein lies a tale. Most people in this room will be aware, to one degree or another, that since the 1970s, there has been a reaction in the academy and among artists against the humanist idea that art communicates the values of a culture or a tradition. This reaction followed upon the social upheavals of the 1960s. The humanist view of art required art historians and other writers on art to tease out the meanings of artworks within their artistic traditions and in relation to their historical circumstances. The circumstances provided the context for the art. The art was assumed to have a certain autonomy from those circumstances. The autonomy of art was assumed to reside in artistic form, and forms were thought to be joined historically in artistic traditions. From about the 1920s to the 1960s, art historians largely concerned themselves with deciphering the meanings of artworks in these terms, and they engaged in a hermeneutics of artistic tradition. In the 1970s, however, a reaction against this humanist view crystallized in a new assumption, the assumption that art is above all a social practice. In other words, that its function in society is foundational to its meaning. Once art historians started to view art as a social practice, the meaning of art became a more complex matter. If art was a social practice, then artworks constructed meaning socially. Artistic form came to be seen as symptomatic not of cultural values, but rather of the artwork's engagement with deeper societal processes. Art no longer seemed so clearly autonomous of its historical circumstances. Today, in my home discipline of art history, the view that art is above all a social practice has generally won out. It's only in some parts of the museum world and in the art market that the older humanist view of art continues to dominate. But I have to be careful not to mislead you. What I have just described is the change that we thought at the time was happening. We thought that what had changed, or was changing, was our understanding of how artworks are meaningful. Now it turns out that we were only partly right. Latent in the change that we were able to see at the time was another, much more important change that we did not see at all. Over the last 10 years or so, it has gradually become clear that by introducing the notion that artworks construct social meaning, the art historians of the 1970s opened the door to a much broader notion that what artworks do may ultimately be more significant than what they mean. Conveying cultural meaning and constructing social meaning, it turns out, are just two of many things that artworks do. Today, young art historians in particular are starting to explore the largely uncharted territory of what artworks do beyond conveying cultural meaning and constructing social meaning. So, I would say that the really important change that has occurred in my adult lifetime is this gradual shift away from the familiar question, what do artworks mean, to a less familiar one, what is it that artworks do? In the second half of today's lecture on the waterfall at Mount Lu, I will try to show how the focus on what artworks do can change the way that we see art and allow any one of us to see art in a more complex way than before. But first, I want to remind you of the power of established modes of interpretation. Let's begin with the fact that Shutal's painting, that you see here, is first and foremost a depiction of a place, Mount Lu in Jiangxi province. Like other famous places in China, Mount Lu is as much a cultural site as a geographic one. In fact, the cultural status of the mountain is highlighted by the artist in his inscription, which transcribes a Tang Dynasty poem, Li Bai's Song of Mount Lu. It's immediately apparent, therefore, that Shutal is using Li Bai's famous poem to bolster the status of his own pictorial image as a cultural icon. The word icon is entirely appropriate here, because if we look beneath the surface appearance of the landscape, Shutal has designed a mountain image with a condensed symbolic structure, and this symbolic image addresses the viewer directly. The painting is structured by several formal elements that have a clear numerological character. There is one waterfall framed by two banks of mist. There are twin peaks above. There is a jutting outcrop in the middle of the painting that ends in a clear tripartite form. And there is a single outcrop in the foreground, down here, that balances the twin peaks at the top. The numerology here is highly specific. The image visualizes an ancient philosophic idea derived directly from the Tao Te Ching, and it is this. The Tao gives rise to the one gives rise to two gives rise to three, and three gives rise to the infinite multiplicity of things. In other words, this mountainscape is an icon of change as a cosmological principle. And Shutal also invoked this very concept in words around the same time in his great theoretical treatise on painting, the Hua Yu Lu. So this is a Taoist image, depicting a place that was strongly associated, Mount Lu, strongly associated with the Lingbao school of Taoism, and illustrating a poem by Li Bai, a devotee of Shanqing school Taoism. It's one of many explicitly Taoist paintings that Shutao painted from 1697 onwards, after he exchanged his religious identity as a Chan Buddhist monk for a new identity as a Taoist devotee. The visual formulation of landscapes as explicitly symbolic configurations was an important part of Shutao's practice at this time. For example, in an album leaf in the British Museum that you see here, he brought together into a single image two mountains near Nanjing that in reality are widely separated, and he exaggerated the regularity of their shapes to create a contrast between them, as if they represent yang and yin cosmic principles. Some of you will recognize that Shutao's model here was a work painted at the end of the 13th century by Zhao Mengfu. Another example of Shutao's interest in creating landscape icons during this period is a work whose whereabouts are currently unknown. Like the waterfall at Mount Lu, the stone bridge at Mount Tiantai illustrates a poem by Li Bai. Mount Tiantai was an important site for Shanqing school Taoism, and Shutao has spoken to that Taoist importance by designing the mountain image as a cosmic diagram with a waterfall at its heart. Of the two men in the waterfall at Mount Lu, the standing man is clearly the more important, placed as he is closer to the central axis of the painting, whereas the seated man, as you can see, seems almost to be an extension of the tree to his left. Over time, one becomes aware, too, that the standing man's erect posture echoes the verticality of the highest peak, and that his feet are obscured by mist, just as is the base of the mountain. We start to see that the artist has established a rhetorical identification of man and mountain. Now, Shutao was already a very famous painter in his own time, at the local level, the regional level, and also at the interregional and national levels. A consequence of his fame was that he knew he could expect viewers to bring to the viewing of his paintings a certain familiarity with his basic approach. An important part of his practice was to make his paintings strongly self-referential in various ways. Very commonly, he included a figure that the viewer could interpret as the artist's visual reference to himself. Here, the standing figure plays that role and belongs to a large group of similar figures, including this one in an album leaf illustrating a poem by Su Shi that Shutao had painted 20 years before the waterfall at Mount Lu, and you'll see that the feet are similarly elided by mist. The self-referential figures in Shutao's paintings are often open to more than one interpretation. Both here and in the album leaf, it may refer either to the artist or to the author of the poem he has transcribed on the painting. The standing figure in the waterfall at Mount Lu can thus be understood as either Shutao or Li Bai, and in this way it establishes an identification between the two men. The basis of the identification is announced in the very first word of the inscription of the poem, Wa, or I. And it is fleshed out in the first line of the poem, I am indeed the madman of Chu. In classical Chinese, as you know, Wa is an unusually strong self-reference, but anything less would be out of place here. The inscription, and indeed the entire painting, is among other things an affirmation of selfhood. Selfhood here also involves the memory of a life lived. Shutao had sojourned at Mount Lu in 1664 as a Chan monk when he was only 23 years old. One of the Buddhist establishments on the mountain, Kaisian Monastery, was very important to Shutao's Chan lineage because his teacher's teacher, the Chan master Muchun Daomin, had achieved enlightenment there. As most of you will know, I assume all of you know, Shu Tao was born into a Ming princely family in the city of Guilin. He makes reference to this fact in his signature on the painting, which reads, Qingxiang Chenren, old man from Qingxiang. At the fall of the Ming, his family was massacred, but the infant Shu Tao was taken to safety by a young family retainer. 20 years later, in 1664, the same family retainer accompanied him to Mount Lu. The two boys had entered the Buddhist Sangha under the names Shu Tao and He Tao, and were still at that point inseparable. Shu Tao's inscription following Li Bai's poem mentions his 1664 sojourn at the mountain. It's hard to imagine that when he chose to include a depiction of himself with a single companion, he was not thinking at some level of He Tao and of the painful years of his youth, when his princely identity put his life so much at risk that he could not declare it openly. Until now, I've discussed the waterfall at Mount Lu only as an image. But what about the way the painting is painted and the way the calligraphy is written? What about the interaction of ink and colour and silk? What about the energy that pulsates through this painting? In the winter of 1696-1697, Shu Tao had left the Sangha to become a full-time professional artist and Taoist adept. Around the time he painted this work, just a few years later, Shu Tao was systematizing the theory of painting that he had developed over decades as a monk painter, and was adapting that theory to his new social status as artist and Taoist. In the treatise that we know today as the Hua Yu Lu, the Taoist phrase that I cited earlier, the Tao gives rise to the one gives rise to two gives rise to three gives rise to the infinite multiplicity of things. That phrase provides the philosophic underpinning for a generative practice of painting. The artist's subjectivity generates a visible world through the traces of the brush. In Shu Tao's practice, the generation of a visible world depended on an expanded conception of the brushstroke that incorporated not just the directing brush trace, but also the receiving ink wash. His famous theory of the one stroke, Yi Hua, conflated painting with the interaction of brush and ink, Bi Mo. Bi Mo was the term that in art criticism traditionally denoted the picture surface. Now, by picture surface here, I don't mean the physical silk support itself, but instead the interaction of brush, ink and colour that acts as an interface between the silk support on the one hand and, on the other, the representational world that the artist summons into existence on the silk. By conflating painting with the picture surface, Shu Tao affirmed the picture surface as the location of subjectivity. His subjectivity pervades the picture surface, bringing order to the flow of energy, inhabiting the entire image and confronting us in the most direct, immediate fashion. Now, Shu Tao was well aware of the historical significance of what he was doing. We know this because he added a note about the history of painting following the transcription of Li Bai's poem. It's in smaller characters, as you can see. Let me quote it. It's said that Guo Heyang, that's to say the great northern Song court painter Guo Xi, painted in the tradition of Li Cheng, and that he captured the aspects of clouds and mists as they form or fade away, and of summits and peaks as they hide or emerge. He dominated his era. In his early years, his work was ingenious and consummately skilled. In his late years, he wielded the brush with increasing virility and power. In my lifetime, I've seen more than 10 of his paintings, most of which were praised by everyone. I was the only one to say nothing, for I did not see in them any surpassing mastery of the hand and eye. Today, I remember my own travels of long ago. I have taken Li Bai's poem, The Song of Mount Lu, to attendant censor Lu Xuzhou, and have made a painting of it, combining my own method with what I have seen of Guoxi's method over the years. One could almost take this painting as Guoxi's own vision. What need is there for the works of old? Shutao is making more than one claim here. On the personal level, as a now aging man, he's identifying with Guoxi in late life, when Guoxi's art left mere ingenuity and skill behind and became virile and powerful in Shutao's language, in Shutao's description. He's also claiming to be the equal of Guoxi, to be a Guoxi in his own time. But he is claiming as well that each moment in history needs its own vision, and that what we see here is the vision of landscape painting that is needed around 1700. Finally, he's claiming the right to dismantle tradition, to select from what he has seen, much of it fake, and to combine it in new ways in order to achieve such a vision. These are claims for subjectivity that could not have been made before the 17th century. Indeed, they could not have been made before Dong Qichang, who is the unspoken point of reference here. But Shutao has taken Dong Qichang's iconoclasm and turned it against that great scholar official artist. Whereas Dong identified himself with a so-called southern school of mainly literati artists, Shutao has identified himself with one of the great names of the opposing northern school of workshop-trained professionals, Guoxi. Shutao's painting is a manifesto in favour of the painting profession to which he now belonged, a painting profession that included artists of all levels of formal education. The waterfall at Mount Lu affirms that painting per se, beyond class-bound traditions of pictorial craft, is a way, a dao, in and of itself. Much of the interpretation that I've developed over the last several minutes has observed the basic protocols of humanist interpretation that were still unchallenged when I wrote my first, at least in the Chinese painting field, when I wrote my first undergraduate paper on Chinese painting in 1976. I have presented Shutao's painting as a work of art, with a capital A work of art that incarnates basic values of Chinese culture as these were reinterpreted by one artist around 1700. Shutao, I've suggested, wanted to raise the practice of painting to the level of a Dao in its own right. To this end, he created a painting that was an image and indeed an icon of change, and a painting that at every level, from the charged atmosphere of the scene down to the pulsating brushwork and ink washes, actually shows change at work as an underlying principle of reality. So, one meaning of the painting is as a manifesto of the individual's potential to access the Tao across his own subjectivity. At the same time, by so conspicuously invoking Li Bai and Guoxi, the artist situates his pictorial manifesto within and against the long history of Chinese culture. A second meaning of the painting, then, is as an affirmation of the belief that the best way to renew tradition is to reinvent it across the prism of one's own subjectivity. Shutao took up this position in conscious opposition to the traditionalism of contemporary classicizing artists such as Wang Hui and Wang Yuanxi. My interpretation has also given due weight to the artist himself as the author of the painting. I shouldn't think that any of you will be in any doubt that the waterfall at Mount Lu is also a statement of selfhood in a biographical sense. With respect to Shutao's authorship, I have presented the painting more in line with the late 20th century view of painting as a social practice, as an act of self-fashioning. Shutao is reckoning here with his past, with his princely birth, and with the consequences of his recent decision to leave the Buddhist Sangha. He is seeking to reaffirm a continuity with his earlier Buddhist identity across the boundary marked by that decision. I've also used the idea of social practice to draw attention to another aspect of the painting, its socio-economic dimension. I've argued that the waterfall at Mount Lu has its context in Chutao's entry into the ranks of full-time professional artists, and that it is not only a statement of selfhood, but also a statement of professional pride. That's quite a lot. So, am I now going to repudiate what I've just said by advancing a different interpretation? Well, not exactly. I don't want to repudiate the interpretation I've offered so far, but I do want to recontextualize the picture of the painting's many meanings that I've been building up by placing these meanings within the larger frame of reference of what the painting does. I think I can do this most efficiently by introducing three new aspects of the painting, or three additional aspects. First of all, this extraordinary painting, it really is an extraordinary painting. Even Chutao himself didn't reach this level more than a limited number of times in his life. This extraordinary painting speaks in a very direct way to our bodies. Well, what is a body? For many of us, it's a sophisticated machine, maybe a machine that's falling apart a bit, but a mechanical construction that houses a range of functional centers with specific jobs to do, all of this within an envelope of skin that regulates the machine. The waterfall at Mount Lu is certainly not addressing a body of this kind. The body that this painting interpolates is an explicitly Taoist body, familiar to all of you here in Hong Kong through its many overlaps with the body as understood in Chinese medicine. This body is not an anatomy, but a physiology, not a machine, but an ecology of flows of energy. A limited number of important centers within the body organize and regulate these flows of energy. The Taoist body that this painting interpolates was often conceptualized as a landscape. So in that sense, the waterfall at Mount Lu confronts the viewer not just body to body, but also landscape to landscape. What I'm getting at is that this landscape painting configures its landscape image partly in bodily terms, for the benefit of viewers who construed their bodies partly in landscape terms. We should also note the amazing luminosity of the painting, which seems to emanate from within more than to be caused by the fall of light. This luminosity signals that the landscape body we see is, in Taoist terms, a perfected body. Why would Chutao create a painting that could do this? The most plausible explanation is that the artist, who had just recently become deeply involved in Taoism, wanted his painting not simply to depict the perfected Taoist body, but actually to enact that body by actualizing it. In other words, the painting has a teaching function. It is meant to change the viewer's perception of what it means to be alive, what it means to be part of an existence that is not solely human. Equally striking is a second aspect of the painting, the incredible spaciousness of the scene that Chutao summons up before our eyes, a spaciousness worthy of any Northern Song painting. This is a second thing that the painting does. It displaces us to another here and now. It moves us from this very lovely lecture hall to another place within the imagination. We usually associate this aspect of painting with representation. It comes easily to us, too easily in fact, to see the painting as a depiction of a world. In fact, the artist has programmed his painting to do something much more dynamic. The painting operates on the viewer's apparatus of vision and expands its possibilities. I'm talking here about a historical viewer, a viewer around 1700, but you may find that the painting operates on your 21st century apparatus of vision as well. Now, to explain what's involved here, I have to take a moment to place Chutao's painting in a much larger historical perspective. Let's remind ourselves that Chinese painters were never exactly in the business of depicting the world out there. mimesis is a strictly Western notion. What the Chinese painter depicted was instead an empirical experience of the world. From a very early date, Chinese painters found a way of organizing experience of the world according to somewhat elastic units of visual experience, which we can call scenic views, if you like. You can see them both around the borders and forming the different registers of the central part of this Tang Dynasty Buddhist composition on the left. When painters thought about the formal compositional problems involved in creating a painting, they had to deal with a technical problem of visual conventions, or the technical problems, plural, of visual conventions. And one of the most important of these technical problems was how to create a basic compositional unit that would correspond to the scenic view. It's this basic compositional unit that I want to focus on here. Let's call it the scenic unit. In Chinese, it's called a jing. In the earliest Chinese paintings, painters, and you can see that on the left, painters didn't worry much about making the scenic units of their paintings in turn scenically continuous with each other. As long as the overall design of the painting was harmonious, individual scenes could have a disjunctive relationship to each other, especially from the point of view of scale. Eventually, though, painters started to seek scenic continuity between the individual scenic units, and by the mid-10th century, their efforts were so successful that the result was a continuum of space and time through the entire painting. The result was Northern Song landscape painting, represented on the right by a painting that is not in fact by Li Chung, though it's attributed to him. And Northern Song landscape painting owed its coherence to the organization of the individual scenic units within an overall hierarchical image. So you've got the mountain at the top, then you have the temple below, and then you have trees, and finally the village, and so on. We sometimes call the organization of space in this kind of painting shifting focus perspective, because such paintings are geared to a viewer who moves through the painting in the imagination. In other words, a viewer who expects a painting to be a depiction of empirical experience of the world. Now, this basic system remained the basis of Chinese ink painting subsequently, and over the centuries, painters invented many ways of making it more complex and layered. Now, alongside these explorations of complex compositions involving many scenic units, during the 17th century, painters, especially literati painters, also became interested in the possibilities of the individual scenic unit. Artists started to produce small-scale albums where each individual leaf used just one scenic unit to create a single scenic view, no matter how large the scene. Shutao was one of the masters of this small-scale album format, as you can see in this depiction of a city that he painted around the same time as the waterfall at Mount Lu. When it came to large-scale hanging scrolls, 17th century artists sometimes tried to treat the larger painting in the same way as a small album leaf, as a single scenic unit. But the narrow format of the painting usually forced them to include more than one unit, more than one jing. Now we come back to the waterfall at Mount Lu, in which Shutao solved the problem of reconciling the single unit with the hanging scroll format. If the purpose of a scenic unit is to create the effect of a unit of visual experience, then shouldn't the standing figure in this painting stand for the experiencing subject? Doesn't that figure, the standing figure, focalize our vision and allow us to equate our own perception of the painting with the figure's perception of the scene? Well, yes and no. The fact that the figure either looks down rather than up, or perhaps even has his eyes closed, it's a little bit difficult to tell, is significant. Our attention is seized by the mountainscape with its waterfall. His attention is not. Our vision and the figure's vision are disaligned. Our vision of the scene is actually aligned with the midpoint of the painting. The twin peaks direct our attention upwards toward the inscription. The whole lower half of the painting, meanwhile, draws our attention downwards toward the mist at the bottom edge. We, as viewers, are placed in the position of an experiencing subject whose vision extends upwards and downwards to encompass the entire scene within a single scenic unit. The standing figure, though, does not join in this vision. He looks down, away from the scene that we see, or closes his eyes entirely. By taking the standing figure out of the equation, Shutao took the principle of a single, all-encompassing scenic unit and scenic view and made it astonishingly immediate. The immediacy is a sign that the waterfall at Mount Lu is able to engage the viewer in the enactment of a particular structure of experience. The most important thing to note about this structure of experience is that it is devoid of hierarchy. It moves laterally in all directions across the picture surface and across the scene. We are very far away here from the hierarchical images of Northern Sung painting. Northern Sung paintings, we might say, enact an experience of socialized order. Shutao's painting, on the other hand, enacts an experience of personal independence. So, the waterfall at Mount Lu enacts the perfected Taoist body, and it also enacts independence. What else does the painting do? Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, the painting is more than 2 meters tall. It's also painted on silk, and it's a mountainscape. Large-scale mountainscapes on silk were a specialty of the great professional painting workshops of Yangzhou, the city where Shutao set up shop as a professional artist himself in 1697. The reason why large-scale mountainscapes on silk were popular in Yangzhou at that time is that the major patrons in the city were salt merchants and bankers. The salt merchants came from Huizhou in Anhui, the bankers from Shanxi, and both owed their wealth to interregional trade. After about 1690, both groups poured money into the construction of mansions with accompanying gardens. The mansions had large reception rooms that needed big paintings, sometimes very, very big paintings. The gardens had miniature mountains constructed from smaller pieces of rock. There was a great demand in the city of Yangzhou for mountainscapes on silk that would visualize the mountainscapes of which the garden mountains were miniature versions. Shutao took advantage of this demand, we know, by charging his customers higher prices for paintings on silk. The bankers liked mountainscapes that depicted interregional trade or Tang palaces that could be understood as metaphors for their own mansions and gardens. Some of the merchants had the Huizhou merchants had the same taste, but others were highly educated individuals who preferred to decorate their walls with more ambitious paintings. The waterfall at Mount Lu shares many of the conventions of paintings by Shutao's professional competitors in Yangzhou. It shares the scale, the silk surface, the invocation of Guoxi, the resonance with miniature garden mountains. But it separates itself from the work of Li Yin, or here Yuanjiang, by its philosophical tenor. What Shutao's painting does at this level is to transmute the fruits of wealth, a mansion, a garden, a piece of expensive interior decoration, into a potential for Taoist self-actualization. The painting holds out an invitation to the recipient to join the artist in this process, and even makes the invitation explicit by pairing the standing figure with a companion. Yes, the two figures can be related to Shutao's memory of his trip to Mount Lu together with He Tao in 1664, But this does not prevent the two figures from operating in a second way as well, as stand-ins for the artist and his friend, the recipient of the painting, even though we don't know who that recipient was. At this level, the painting seeks to enact the transcendence of commerce through Taoist self-actualization, and it does so through an affective intensity so great that the decorative function of the painting is effaced. Over the last several minutes, I've noted three things that this painting does. Three operations that it carries out when an appropriately informed viewer encounters the painting. This way of characterizing a painting treats it as a field of operations, an operational field. The operations might be religious, as in the enactment of the perfected Taoist body, or cognitive, as in the painting's enactment of independence, or ideological, as in its transcendence of commerce. We can also redescribe as operations the features that I noted in the first part of this lecture. Self-fashioning can be understood as an operation of social insertion. Turning painting into a manifesto of professional pride can be understood as an attempt by the painting to elicit solidarity from fellow artists and respect from those who supported them, another operation of a narrowly social nature. The painting's character as an icon of change, accessible through the artist's subjectivity, can be understood as both a religious and a philosophical operation, an attempt to make change visible to us. And finally, the painting's claim to renew tradition by reinventing it through the prism of the artist's subjectivity can be understood as enacting independence from the past and as making a claim to cultural authority. These are all things that this painting does, alongside others of a more mundane nature. This painting also offers itself as an economic investment, for example. When we consider an artwork in terms of what it does, rather than what it means, it becomes difficult to think of it as having much autonomy from its circumstances. Considering what an artwork does tends to make us aware instead of the contrasting heteronomy of art. By heteronomy, I mean the way that any artwork is simultaneously engaged in multiple areas of experience and generates value from that very fact. The heteronymous artwork is both material and immaterial. The waterfall at Mount Lu is both a tangible artifact hanging on a wall and also a place where the many operations I've described lead one's eye on all sorts of journeys of thought. The painting is a silk surface that has been configured with an image. Certainly, that is a constant. But the painting is also a field of potentiality that every viewer actualizes differently according to the conditions of viewing and the quality of attention that the viewer brings to the painting. One viewer notices the Taoist dimension, another is caught up in the scene, a third cares only about the brushwork. One viewer looks quickly, another studies the painting with great care, another is temporarily listening to an iPod. One viewer is a painter himself, another is an academic, a third is an accountant. One viewer lived in 1705, another in 1800, a third lives in 2012. You are looking at the painting today in a lecture hall across reproductions at giant scale, but on another occasion, you may encounter the painting reproduced at a very small scale in a book, or you may even encounter the painting itself in an exhibition. Every viewing is situationally different, and every viewing configures the painting differently according to and every viewer configures the painting differently according to the way her eye moves through the operational field of the painting. As an operational field, the waterfall at Mount Lu is inexhaustible, and yet that raises a question. What, in that case, is the basis of its stability as an artwork? What makes the infinitely varied actualizations of this painting all the waterfall at Mount Lu? This is not a question that most of us would normally think to ask, even the specialists, even the art historians. But precisely because Art historians have not yet asked this question. We, have not noticed one of the single most important things that an artwork does. We all know already, without being art historians, that artworks intervene in the environment and that one of their basic functions is to configure the environment in some way. Hang the waterfall at Mount Lu on your living room wall, and I assure you that your living room environment will be reconfigured dramatically. We also know that artworks often evoke something that is elsewhere or exists only in the imagination, and that a second basic function is therefore to represent, or in more Chinese terms, to manifest. This painting manifests an experience at Mount Lu, but an experience that has several layers, since this painting represents not only Mount Lu, but also Shu Tao's personal memory of sojourning at Mount Lu in the past, and Li Bai's experience of Mount Lu is recorded in his poem. Earlier in this lecture, I also tried to show some of the many ways in which the waterfall at Mount Lu communicates and therefore contributes to the meaningfulness of our world. Finally, most of us realize instinctively that artworks are events as much as they are objects, and that there may be several layers to the event of a single artwork. This painting conspicuously records the event of its own making in the flow of ink and colour across its silk surface. But it also exists in front of our eyes as the exciting crystallization of an image and of an atmosphere from that flow of ink and colour. In other words, a further basic function of an artwork is to intervene in our temporality and to open up a fold in time. Pay any serious attention to this painting at all, and the normal temporality of your life will be disturbed during the time that you do it. All these functions of art have long been familiar, vaguely at least, to all of us, even if we could not necessarily articulate them systematically. What we've all missed, however, the specialist included, is a function that we will not see at all until we embrace the idea that art is not autonomous but heteronymous, and that the heteronymous artwork is a field of operations, an operational field. Because only then do we realize that one of the basic functions of art is to choreograph this complexity, to get all its different operations to work together in the service of coherence. I have a word for this choreographic function. I call it articulation. To articulate is, on the one hand, to bring different parts in relation to each other or with each other in a way that allows movement. Think of your own body when you walk. But to articulate is also to make a coherent statement. The limbs in movement allow your body to move in a given direction. In art, operations of the kind I've described for the waterfall at Mount Lu enter into relation with each other in a way that allows movement and makes the operational field itself a coherent statement. A properly articulated artwork, I can now say, is an articulate artwork. Not in the sense of being transparently understandable, but in the sense of offering us a complexity. I began this lecture by reaffirming that Shu Tao's painting is a masterpiece, but in the post-humanist view that I've been putting forward, masterpieces, truly great works of art, are not expressions of genius. Rather, they are the result of extraordinary artistic labour. The world of visual and material culture is vast and fascinating in its infinite diversity, so I'm certainly not in favour of writing the history of art simply as a history of masterpieces. But the masterpiece differs from other artworks in two essential ways. It allows us to see in a single place a particularly large range of the ways in which art in general works. And it's a place where the diverse forces that structure human existence at any moment become visible in all the complexity of their interaction. The masterpiece, however obscure, puzzling, or challenging it may be, is ultimately the most profoundly articulate of artworks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for that eye-opening and mind-opening lecture. I think we only have time for about 2 or 3 questions. Maybe just 3 rules here. A, B, and C. Please be articulate, as the lecture says. So you have to wait for a mic so that we can all hear what you have to say. B, please be brief. Just ask one question, short and sweet. And C, please be centered, focus on the issues at hand in this lecture, and don't ask Jonathan about whether he thinks the Mona Lisa is smiling or not, or something like that. Okay, so questions, please. Yes, one from Mr. Lee himself.
Professor Hay, the modern artist Zhang Daiqing, is he closely influenced by Shito?
Yes, he was. He was very, very deeply influenced by Shito, but he's living in a very different time. And to set a painting by Zhang Daiqing next to a painting by Shito is to measure the difference of 300 years. It's to see that many things changed. For example, Zhang Daiqing's paintings, you'll remember, are much flatter than Shito's paintings even. And yet, the flatness of Shito's paintings, although it was less great, opened the way for Zhang Daiqing's flatness. You'd also see that Zhang Daiqing had a very different kind of life and different set of connections. He was a very cosmopolitan man, studied in Japan. As you know, he had a different background, different training. He wasn't a Buddhist monk. He trained originally in the textile business, and he brought some of his experience of that into his paintings, in his sense of design. I could, if this were not a lecture on Shito, I could develop a similar kind of analysis of Zhang Daiqing's work, but what it would do is it would reveal a different kind of articulacy, more suited to the mid-20th century.
Other questions? It's a question over there, the lady wearing the black jacket.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. It's very inspiring. My name is Eugenia. I'm doing research in SKU. And my question is, I've just been to an exhibition of the paintings in the same period. And I found that many artists at that time actually will recreate or repaint the paintings they like. And what is the social meaning behind that? And do you find it's interesting, or how they influence the painting development in China?
Do you mean that they recreate their own compositions, or that they recreate the compositions of the past?
The past and their fellow artists.
Ah, I see. Well, one of the things that the artists were, in literary studies you have the concept of intertextuality that we sometimes use in this field too. We might talk about intervisuality, if you like. And the artists were constantly involved in a dialogue with their peers. They were constantly situating themselves in relation to their peers. Shito, for example, painted many paintings in the style of Bada. He painted many paintings that are closely related to works by particular Yangzhou artists. He painted many works that were clearly meant to demonstrate to people that he could do a Wang Hui painting better than Wang Hui. He could do a Dong Qizhang better than Dong Qizhang. There's an element of competition there. And the social significance of it lies partly in the marketplace, but it's partly more than that. He is trying to impose himself as a leader of the art world. But then there's the relationship to the artworks of the past, and one way of defining modernity in this kind of period, in the early what people sometimes call the early modern period, other people will call it late imperial China, other people will just call it the early Qing dynasty, right? But one way of defining modernity in that period is in terms of the affirmation of difference. Because it was really not until about the late 16th century that artists claimed the right for their own time to be completely different from the past. And to introduce a kind of relativism into their understanding of cultural history. And so the way in which they affirmed that difference, paradoxically, was by doing paintings in the style of earlier artists. They took on these great monuments of the past in order to show that they could reinvent the compositions, the styles, for modern times. I mean, a little bit in the same way that we see operas today in modern stagings, 19th century operas in modern stagings, or Shakespeare plays in modern stagings.
Time for one more question. Yes.
Professor Kuhn. You're absolutely allowed to.
I don't get a chance to ask you questions. I'm interested in the idea of the scenic units you were describing. So you had the one of the enactments of viewer with the mountain. You had the one of the scenic unit, the creation of the scenic unit with the figure with the mist. I was wondering about the third figure, the companion figure. What's that figure enacting?
Oh, well, I wouldn't. Well, let's see. That figure is very interesting because it's a figure that has to play a number of different roles in the painting. It has to signify, if you want to, first of all, think of it in semiotic terms. That figure has to signify the recipient, which is quite important, because then the recipient is invited in, is acknowledged, if you like, is acknowledged as a friend, you know. Then the figure is also Hutao. It's this buried memory, you know. It's concealed. It's not acknowledged. He doesn't mention Hutao directly. It's a hidden aspect of the painting. But then there's something else which it has to do with orders of observing. It's a more technical kind of thing. We look at the painting, we look directly at the landscape, then we look at the standing figure who at first we imagine is looking at the landscape, and then we look at this other figure who is closer to us and who we imagine is maybe looking at the other figure, but in fact, he's not. He's looking across.
Right.
Yes, exactly. So the reason why he's not, if you like, the position of the figure already gives you the sense of these orders these different orders of observing, but he's looking across for the same reason that the figure of Shu Tao has an eye, as you would have seen. It's just a line. It's just a line. So it's a way of taking a very active vision out of the equation. Shu Tao doesn't want these figures to interfere with the really important looking, which you're looking. See, that's why he's doing it. He's deliberately, taking it out of play. That's how I would see it. Now you have a thought here. I want to draw that thought out of you. So Professor Kuhn was my student once upon a time, so I'm allowed to do this.
That's so unfair. It's very disjunctive. I mean, I can see the horizontal plane and how it redirects you across that way, because they're essentially looking at opposite directions in some way.
Yes, you're right.
So I see him more as a pivot. If you had to find something that anchored, I would have found the anchor perhaps in him.
Ah, right. he is an anchor. I don't think that the standing figure is an anchor. I don't think I would have thought of it that way. Yeah, the companion figure, I think, works as an anchor. And also, Professor Kuhn has pointed out something very important there, which is that because the figure is looking across the surface of the painting, that figure reinforces the idea of laterality. This is a painting where everything is moving across the surface and then up and down and so on. So it thematizes, you could argue that it thematizes that laterality. So you see, I was right to draw that thought out. So thank you very much. You've taught me something.
Thank you. Now, Jonathan, in Hong Kong, we have a philosophy that nothing actually exists without an official photograph. So we have to have an official photograph now. So I'd like to invite the Dean and also Mr. Lee up onto the stage, and the Dean will give some gifts as a token of our appreciation for the talk.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a great honor.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and thank you all for coming. Please come.